Hello students of English and welcome to Excel at English, a channel devoted to helping you achieve excellence in the analysis of English language and literature. In this video we will be exploring the dystopian genre as part of a series on The Handmaid's Tale. This lesson will be aimed specifically at students for AQA English language and literature, but really will be broadly valuable to any A-level student studying the text, or if you're studying the text for any course, this could be helpful for you. Please check the playlists for other video lessons in this series, and if what you want or if what you're interested in isn't there yet, then subscribe and wait and see, or even better, put a request in the comments for me. So let's think about the dystopian genre. You may know that a dystopia is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible. And we have two antonyms, dystopia and utopia. The word utopia actually came first. This is the root word. And a utopia means an ideal or perfect society, but a politician coined this phrase dystopia in the 19th century, I believe, by adding this prefix dis. So as in the word dysfunctional, we have the reverse, the negation of utopia. And if a utopia is ideal or perfect, then a dystopia has to be the worst of possible worlds. So understanding how dystopias function, we need to know that they are, I guess, possible versions of our own society. Dystopias present us with twisted or broken versions of what could conceivably be our own society as a way of generating our sense of fear or anxiety. And I guess the image and the caption sum it up pretty well there. Dystopias function on this premise of, wouldn't it be terrible if this were to happen? And I guess in the picture there you've got some kind of post-nuclear radioactive wasteland. Sounds fun. So how have dystopias functioned in literature? Thomas More was a famous theologian and philosopher in the 1500s. He was also a politician who failed to support Henry VIII's new marriage, and so Henry VIII cut his head off, along with quite a few other people, including a couple of his wives. But Thomas More is also famous for trying to create a vision of an ideal society in his political text, Utopia. So it begins with this desire to project the perfect or ideal society, which then is going to be subverted later. In the 18th century, Jonathan Swift wrote a satirical novel, Gulliver's Travel, and this presented readers of the time with a mirror of their own society, but with heightened, exaggerated faults. And there is satire. Satire, you may know, is where a text or presents a kind of an exaggerated or heightened version of a society as a way of indicating its faults. And dystopias seem to have this sort of satirical function in that we look at these imagined worst-case scenario societies and we use them to evaluate our own society, evaluate the problems or perhaps the directions in which our own society is travelling. So it's interesting to think of this relationship between satire and dystopia. It's also worth noting that the epigraphs at the beginning of Handmaid's Tale, one of those is written by Jonathan Swift. And if you research, I believe Jonathan Swift offered a satirical response to the Irish famine, in which he wrote a text suggesting that the Irish just simply eat their children. Obviously that wasn't a serious suggestion, it was a satirical suggestion based on the worst of possible worlds. This would be a terrible thing to do. Of course, some people perhaps actually treated that seriously, treated the idea seriously. That was Swift's way of perhaps revealing flaws or hypocrisies within the society that he lived in. So the concept of satire is key for us. Dystopian literature really begins to thrive in the 20th century. So those are the years beginning 1900, because this is a century of tyranny and political extremism, of near continual war. The paradigm, the greatest example of, or considered to be the paradigm, the greatest example of dystopian fiction, is George Orwell's 1984, which he writes just after the collapse of Nazi Germany and before the beginning of the Cold War with Soviet Russia. And 1984 envisions a futuristic society in which a totalitarian government has almost complete control over people's lives through surveillance. 1984 has been deeply influential. It's influenced political language. It's influenced the way that we think. Terms like Big Brother and Newspeak, the language of this novel have become a part of, become accepted into common English usage. So a deeply, deeply influential novel, and one that's almost been seen to be prophetic, like a prophecy. Orwell's novel is often claimed to have accurately predicted social and technological change, to have accurately predicted conditions under the communist regimes of the 50s and 60s, perhaps even to have accurately predicted the big data mass surveillance possibilities of the society that we live in currently, where organizations like Google or Facebook can collect vast amounts of data, facial recognition software, for example. So dystopias like 1984 have contemporary resonance. They have they don't go away. The dystopias that we remember and that are most popular are ones that perhaps become more relevant as time goes on and not less relevant as time goes on. And this is why dystopian ideas are highly influential in our culture, in our film, in our art, and in our music. And the themes of these dystopias, or dystopian themes, have adapted to reflect different political changes and social fears. So, for example, there is, of course, at the moment, a trend in dystopias related to environmental catastrophe, something that we've become very concerned about as a society in the last few decades. Of course, dystopias being written now can reflect those anxieties of the societies in which they're written. Just a sidetrack here to consider the notion of what's called the literary canon. The term canon, or the adjective canonical, refers to works that are definitive, works that are said to define an area of study. So there's considered to be a canon of English literature, which is the greatest works of English literature. These are identified as the finest and most influential, and the canon offers you a way of, or offers literary critics a way of evaluating texts. We can evaluate a text by looking at the way that it relates to the greatest examples of English literature, or the way that it relates to the greatest examples of a genre. So we've already done that perhaps by considering parallels between Gulliver's Travels, the Jonathan Swift novel, and the Handmaids. So the canonical approach is to reflect on perhaps the central works of literature and reflect on how they compare to whichever work that you're studying. Now, the canon is very slow to kind of add works to it, and canonical works are generally, historical or very traditionally highly viewed works such as Chaucer, Shakespeare, King James Bible, Dickens. Orwell is not yet canonical. Who decides what's canonical? It's actually a very difficult, vague concept. But we could perhaps suggest that there be a dystopian genre, a canon for the dystopian genre, a collection of central works which really define the dystopian genre, and which works would be in that dystopian genre. If you're a football fan or a film fan or a fan of nearly anything, there's always people who enjoy arguing about what the greatest football team ever, or construct your greatest football team, or who were the greatest ever Premiership champions, or likewise in film, what's your top 10 greatest films. And I guess that's the same practice as considering a literary canon. Which dystopian works would be canonical, and how would they compare to The Handmaids? This is a way of evaluating The Handmaids by thinking about works like 1984 or Brave New World, and thinking about the way that they have influenced Atwood in writing The Handmaids and the difference between the two. You might also very well argue, someone really should argue, that The Handmaid's Tale belongs in any canon of dystopian fiction. Canons, as I mentioned, they are as a concept quite controversial, and the English literary canon is mainly works by wealthy white men, which is controversial in that many people view the English canon as kind of inherently biased and socially biased. And I suppose that's part of Atwood's reaction in writing The Handmaid's Tale, in that she looks at a genre which she loves, the dystopian genre, and sees that it really has no authentic female perspectives in it. And Atwood being Atwood, she sets out to write that female perspective and does so very successfully. So, in the wider reading box there's I offer a couple of links that give you an overview of some of the most influential dystopian texts. 1984 is central and really a key text for your wider reading. 1984 is a great text to read anyway, even if you're not interested in studying it. It's a central text in English literature that everyone should read. But it's also the most useful dystopian text to read if you're going to evaluate The Handmaids, because Atwood is writing The Handmaids in part in reaction to 1984. Let's think more broadly about dystopian features. I've composed here a little hit list of some of the most common recurring themes in dystopian genre. Some of these themes, I guess, are quite unique in that they occur in one or two particular texts. Some of these themes are more universal in that they feature in a great number of dystopian texts. But can we seek to find defining features of a dystopian text, features that all dystopian texts share? Well, pick from the list here: totalitarian governments, surveillance societies, as we've discussed; technocracies, which are societies where there is rule by experts or rule by scientists; but also theocracies. Of course, The Handmaids is a theocratic, Gilead is a theocratic society where we have rule by religious extremists. Post-apocalyptic societies, fertility crises. Handmaids is not the only fertility crisis dystopia. The social divisions of different types, class warfare, environmental calamity, anarchy. Many of these are features of either central features or secondary features of The Handmaids, and that's one way that we can draw comparisons between The Handmaids and other dystopian texts, to what extent they share similar premises, similar propositions. Dystopian themes, though, they are flexible, and as we said before, they change with society's growing needs. The things that we worry about now will make tomorrow's great dystopian literature. A really good way of considering what is essential to the dystopian genre would be to look at patterns in kinds of conflict. And there are various models of conflict in literature that are available for you as tools to evaluate. I quite like this one that can be found very easily online, because it divides literature into three ages or stages: the classical, the modern and the postmodern. And I feel like that's quite an interesting framework. I'm not saying it's perfect, but any kind of framework like this, you can use it to ask interesting questions of a text or of a genre. Of these 9 forms of conflict presented here, which dominate the dystopian genre and which are present in The Handmaid's Tale? Well, certainly The Handmaid's Tale is certainly a modern text, and to a certain extent it's a postmodern text. All of those, or many of those dystopias, feature some kind of conflict between individuals and society. You could argue that the central panel, the individual's conflict in a conflict, or their conflict versus themselves, is central is perhaps the most universal form of conflict in literature, because we always have internally conflicted characters in literature to which we can relate to. We can't really relate to resolved characters who have perhaps no inner conflict. We also, though, have at least one of those postmodern concerns in The Handmaid's Tale, which is this idea of the individual versus reality. Technology is perhaps a lesser element. There are some technological advances portrayed in The Handmaid's Tale, but Atwood, for reasons that we'll discover later, shied away from using far-fetched technological premises in her dystopia. There is, however, conflict between the individual and reality, and Offred frequently questions, I guess, the reality of her own perceptions, and there's some kind of blurring between between events that are real and imagined in this novel, and that's an essentially postmodern form of conflict. A note on the side about the poster and the language used in the poster. The language of this poster, man versus nature, man versus self, man versus reality, is itself androcentric, which is to say that it proposes, or it has by a default, a male as the central character of these conflicts in literature. Now, The Handmaid's Tale itself is a reaction to this kind of androcentric normality, this male-centered view of the world. And really, actually, the language of this poster is better reflected by talking about the individual versus society, or the individual versus self, by neutralizing it, so that we don't presuppose that actually, in order to experience conflict in literature, the default position is that you will be a man. This is very much the motivating, or one of the things that motivates Atwood in writing The Handmaid's Tale. The fact that female perspectives have been marginalised in dystopias, or underrepresented, and The Handmaid's Tale is in an attempt to redress that balance, to put that right. So finally then, here's a quick summary of learning. We've learned in this video lesson that dystopias are possible versions of our own society, which are in some way twisted and distorted, and allow us to reflect on aspects of our own society. We've considered the idea of evaluating a text against canonical texts of a genre, and how we can draw comparisons between central texts and the text that we're studying. We've talked about the way that dystopias reflect the concerns of societies in which they're made, so they're based in contemporary relevance, but often that contemporary relevance can grow as technology, for example, develops. So these dystopias can have the power to become more relevant and not less relevant across time. And we've talked finally, or explored, some of the thematic concerns, some of the thematic patterns in dystopias, and also how we can use frameworks of conflict to understand what happens in dystopias. So that's all for this video lesson. If you found it useful, please click like to show your appreciation, or even better, leave a comment or a request below. You can look at the channel page to see what else is in the playlist, and subscribe to keep up to date with any new content. Thank you for watching Excel at English, and most of all, good luck with your studies.